I want to kick us off with a little bit of a thought experiment before we get started into things. I want you to picture for me, or just imagine that I told you I went for a drive yesterday, unlikely in the circumstances, but I went for a drive and I pulled up in this car park and I was just winding down my window when all of a sudden this total stranger came up to me, and before I knew what was happening, they shoved this stick so far up my nose that my eyes started to water, and all I could do was just sit there and just sort of blink, and the tears rolling down my face. And then, again, before I knew what was happening, he pulled the stick out and proceeded to drive it so far down my throat that it felt like it was scratching on my tonsils, and I just sat there and he was digging around in my mouth, and then they pulled the stick out, turned around, and walked away. Just left me sitting in the car. It is a true story. And I guess the question is, how would you respond to that story? If you've ever had a COVID test before, you might be able to join the dots. You might offer me a bit of compassion. Oh, no, mate, those tests are the worst. If you're a medical professional, you've worked around hospitals, you've had to have 20-something of these tests, you might be a little less easy on me. Come on, mate. They're really not that bad. But imagine for me, if I told you this same story 2 years ago. And so you had no way of knowing anything about the all-important context. So you didn't know that there's this global pandemic going on, that the New South Wales government has set up these testing stations in car parks, that the only reason I went to that car park was to get one of these tests. And imagine that you didn't have access to any of those important details, that this total stranger is actually a trained medical professional, that the stick that went up my nose had some cotton on the end. It's part of a medical procedure that was going to show if I had this dangerous virus. The point is, context and detail are absolutely critical in informing how we understand a story, and they're critical in determining what we take away from a story. And so that's going to be really key as we look at Joshua chapters 10, 11, and 12 this morning. And if that sounds like a lot, it's because it is. And I want to apologize because I've done my best to sort of condense today's message. I don't think I've done a very good job of that. So we'll see. We're just going to see how much ground we can cover in 20 minutes. So if you're with me, we're going to do our best, and by God's grace, you'll still be awake at the end of it. So, great. So I think I've broken it down into what I want to call a three-part extravaganza. We're going to look at, first of all, what's actually happening in these chapters and why. Then I want to take a look at some of the accusations that people have brought against God after reading these chapters. And finally, have a look at how these ideas we've been talking about connect into our bigger picture of the world and what we think about God. Now, the reason I'm taking this trouble is because it's important to acknowledge there's some confronting and there's some challenging material in these chapters that we're going to cover today. And if we read them in a way that isn't very careful, it can be tempting to think that these stories are just all about destruction, that they're the story of a violent people and an angry God. And tragically, that's the picture that a lot of people have taken away from these passages. But I want to suggest that that's not an accurate picture. That's a distorted picture simply because it hasn't been formed with a proper grasp of the context, and it hasn't been formed with a proper attention to detail. And so that's why we're going to break things down in this way. So first of all, what's going on in these chapters? Well, in very simple terms, what we see in chapters 10 and 11 are a story of two of the major military campaigns as Israel conquers the land of Canaan. And they actually have a very similar structure, these two chapters. So we'll see a little bit of the repeated patterns that happen. In both chapters, we see Israel goes up against massive armies that are formed from a combination of kingdoms. In chapter 10, the first army they face is comprised of the neighbors of the Gibeonites. And you'll remember from Heather's message last week that Israel made this ill-advised treaty because they failed to consult God about this thing. And now we see them having to go in to defend the Gibeonites because guess what? Their neighbors aren't too happy about the whole peace treaty situation. So that's what happens in chapter 10. In chapter 11, Israel faces an even larger coalition of nations, 13 different kingdoms coming against Israel at the same time. So in both chapters, incredible odds that Israel is facing. But we see that in both chapters, God gives Israel the victory. These massive armies, they turn and they flee, and Israel pursues. And as Israel pursues, they actually embark on a series of battles that takes them out into other regions of the land of Canaan. And so we can sort of see in the map the the first two arrows that sweep down into the southwest region. This is chapter 10. We go down towards Gaza, and when the Israelites get towards Gaza, they turn around, come back through the land, devoting the cities of that land to destruction. And in chapter 11, they move up with that vertical arrow towards the north of the land, up to a city called Hazor. And when they conquer that city, they turn around, come back through the land, devoting those cities to destruction. We still with me there, following the arrows? Great. So it's these descriptions of destruction that are the really confronting parts of these passages. And we're going to unpack that a little bit, in a little bit of time. But at the end of chapter 11, there's a bit of a summary, and the author draws our attention to a few key things. He wants to highlight the obedience of Joshua, that in conducting all of this conquest, that Joshua was simply being obedient to everything that God had commanded Moses. And he also draws our attention to the fact that all of this land was given to Israel as inheritance. And that carries us over into chapter 12. Chapter 12 is just easy to remember, two lists of all of the lands and kings that Israel conquered under Moses, under Joshua, and that all of this land was again given to Israel as a possession. So that's what happens in the chapters. We did it. Good work, guys. And now I would really encourage you guys to read these passages yourself if you haven't had the chance to already. There's so much more detail. I cannot do it justice in such a short space of time. And as well, I'm about to make some pretty serious claims about what I believe God is saying to us about himself. And I just want to remind us, again, I don't want anybody here to take anything that I say seriously unless you can find it in Scripture for yourself. It's the Word of God that is the authority this morning and always. So there's three main points. Three main points that I think the author is highlighting for us in these passages. And I've said, I feel like I'm going on about this, but I'll say it again. Context and detail are important. And the context we're talking about is basically the lead up in the biblical narrative to Joshua. So the first 5 books of the Bible. And the reason why this is important is because by the time we get to these stories in Joshua, we already know a lot about who God is, what he's like. We know a lot about Israel. We even know a fair bit about the inhabitants of the land that are being driven out. And so we're gonna unpack a little bit about that now. The first thing that I think the author wants to highlight to us from these passages is that God was fighting for Israel. This comes up time and time again in chapter 10 and 11. God is throwing enemy armies into confusion. In chapter 10, we see him throwing literal hailstones down from the sky. In the first major battle of chapter 10, God takes out more of the enemy army than the Israelite army is able to with their swords. And then we have this incredible situation where God actually stops the sun from moving across the sky in one part of chapter 10 as well, in response to a request from Joshua. So it's very clear that God is intimately involved with his people. And I think that's the real takeaway from us. God is not far removed from Israel. He's not far removed from us. I think that's a very encouraging point for us to hold in our minds. Now, the second major idea that the author is highlighting for us here is simply that God is faithful. And I think this is an idea that we've encountered time and time again through Joshua. In short, God he comes through on his word. And that is an encouraging thing. We see this in the battles that every time he says, look, guys, don't be afraid. I'm going to give you the victory. That's exactly what happens. God never deceives Israel as to what's going on. But we also see this in terms of the inheritance. So it's highlighted that the land is given as inheritance to Israel. And when we appreciate this statement in the context of the promise that was made to a man hundreds of years before these battles occurred in Joshua, way back in Genesis, God promised Abram that his descendants would possess this land. Every time the author of Joshua says the land was given as inheritance to Israel, what he's really saying is God comes through on his word. When God makes a promise, you can be sure that it's going to check out. And I think the other thing that's great about this, when we look at the fact that God is faithful, we see what he is achieving by being involved with humanity. So we've seen that he's not far removed, but now we see, well, actually, he's teaching his people that he is trustworthy. He is inviting them into a relationship, a constructive relationship with him, one that is built on trust. Now, the final idea that I think the author wants to highlight for us here is that God requires obedience. Obedience matters to God. Now, the victories, we see a lot of victories in chapter 10 and 11. They contrast with that embarrassing defeat that we saw when Israel first approached the city of Ai chapters ago in Joshua. And on one hand, you have a battle which it seems like Israel should have won. It should have been an easy thing, right, back at Ai, but they lost. And then in chapters 10 and 11, these crazy situations, they never should have been able to win these battles, and yet they did. And the difference we see between these two situations is obedience. Obedience matters to God. And I think if we ask ourselves, well, why? Why is obedience such a big thing? Looking at Israel, we're able to understand why it matters to God. First of all, the context, so Genesis has shown us that God is a righteous God whose nature does not change. And therefore, that has serious implications for you and I. If we're people who can choose to do good and choose to do bad, but God's nature never changes, then in order for us to have a relationship with him, it's necessary for us to align ourselves with him by responding in obedience to the way that he has called us to live. And that's exactly what he's given Israel just back in prior books through the law that he gave to Moses. He said, I'm righteous. If you want to have a relationship with me, this is what your lives are going to need to look like. So that's the first reason obedience matters. But then in Joshua here as well, we see, again, God is involved in his people. He's bringing about a very specific plan in the land of Canaan here, and he's inviting Israel to be a part of it. It's very simple. If we're not willing to obey when God invites us to be a part of his plan, we're simply not going to be able to play the part that he has for us to play. And God being God, he's still going to achieve his purposes, but we're just not going to be able to be participants in that plan. So two reasons, I think, why obedience matters to God. But if we reflect on those 3 points, I think we have a lot of grounds for encouragement in passages that otherwise are quite confronting, right? So God is intimately involved in his people, and the reason for this is that he wants to show us that he's trustworthy. He wants to invite us into a relationship, a constructive relationship with him. And he wants to invite us to align ourselves through obedience to participate in the plan that he has for humanity. Encouraging stuff. And guess what? That brings us to the end of the first part of the 3-part extravaganza. So well done. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Everyone's still awake. This is great. So the next thing that I do want to talk about, and really thank you because you're doing awesome. This is a lot of ground to cover. We haven't talked about this confronting material. We haven't talked about the destruction that occurs in these passages. And it gives us a lot to chew over. I just read briefly for you a few verses that come after the defeat of Hazor to sort of give you a picture of this. In verse 11 of chapter 11, we have this description. They struck with the sword all who were in Hazor, devoting them to destruction, and there was none left that breathed. And then in verse 14, and all the spoil of these cities and the livestock the people of Israel took for their plunder, but every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. It's very confronting stuff. I think it's right that we wrestle with these things in our hearts. And I think it's okay. It's okay to be confused. It's even okay not to understand why God would choose to deliver his purpose in this sort of way. But at the end of the day, I think we need to remember that we have a very simple choice with regards to responding to these passages. And it's simply, are we willing to trust God's wisdom? Are we willing to take the Bible seriously in what it says when it says that he is righteous, he is just, and yet he has given Israel the victory in these situations? Now, without the context, these passages they're offensive. And many people have sort of read these passages and gone on to bring very serious accusations against God. And some of those accusations I want to take a look at now. Probably the big one, the big idea is that perhaps God is immoral for allowing this destruction or commissioning this destruction to take place. And if we're going to take this claim seriously and see if it actually has, if it actually stands up at all, then we need to answer a very sad but a very important question, and that is it always wrong to take life? And we know from the law that God gave Noah and Moses that he thinks, yes, that there are some times where it is necessary to take life. And we know from even very recent, very tragic examples in our own societies where broken and violent people have taken guns into schools or run with knives into crowds. We know in situations like that it is right for people with special authority in our societies, like policemen, to take special action in those situations in order to limit the amount of damage that those violent individuals can do to the rest of the community. And when we look at the story of the conquest here, when we look at it, again, with full context, full detail, we start to see that actually this situation isn't that different. To start with, Genesis again shows us that God is someone with special authority. He has special authority because he's the creator. He's the creator of these lands. They belong to him. If he chooses to drive out a people group, he has the authority to do that. There's no moral question there. The land belongs to God. And not only is God the creator of the land, but he's also the creator of the people, right? So if he sees fit to bring punishment to bear upon these people, again, there's no moral question here. He has the authority to do these things. And this raises the question then, well, if it's necessary for God to step in such a drastic way, then what is it? What is it that these people have done that would necessitate God stepping in? And Deuteronomy here gives us an answer to that. In chapter 9, God speaks to Israel through Moses saying, look, it's not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you're going in to possess this land, but it's because of the wickedness of these nations that I'm going to be driving them out. And in chapter 18 of Deuteronomy, we see a very stark and confronting list of some of the things that are actually going on in this land. Things like sorcery, speaking to the dead, speaking to evil spirits, but also things like burning their sons and daughters as human sacrifices to the false gods of this land. It's pretty sobering and pretty confronting stuff. And when we take this detail and this context into account, we start to see that actually the reason that we see God enacting such confronting destruction in these passages, it's actually the same reason that God gave his son. It's the same reason that Jesus came to die for us. And the reason is that God is a responsible and merciful creator, and he rules with justice. And that means that he is unwilling to allow sin to simply go on indefinitely. Now, a lot of the other claims that people bring against God in these passages, they fall down flat as well, I think, when we appreciate this more full picture of who God is. The idea that God is bloodthirsty or impulsive, that he loves violence. Well, he's not creating war for the sake of war, is he? He's dealing with specific sin in a specific people group at a specific point in time. The idea that God is racist, almost laughable when we think about the stories of Rahab and her household, the story of the Gibeonites. Even though they acted with deception, we see that God has responded to these people. He obviously cares much more about the content and the character of people's hearts than he does about their ethnicity. And I think that's a wonderful thing to reflect on and celebrate today, being Harmony Day. The idea that God might be unforgiving, all we have to do is look at the history of God's relationship with Israel to see that he is most definitely someone who perseveres with grace. He is a God rich in forgiveness. So really the only way to support any of these claims is by chopping this text to pieces and taking the most confronting bits and removing them entirely out of their context. And that's just not a responsible way to handle any text at all. And with that, congratulations, we've made it to the end of the second part of the 3-part extravaganza. And I can see we're starting to fade a bit. And that's to be, that's totally understandable. But I do want to leave us on a high note, I guess, although I think there's a lot of encouraging things to be taken throughout these passages. But what I want to look at now is just how these ideas about who God is connect with a bigger picture of how we see the world and what that really means. And so the final section is called the big picture. And although I've talked a lot about context and detail, one thing I haven't talked about is the context that each of us carries into every conversation that we have. Every book that we read, every movie that we watch, we're actually perceiving and we're responding through a personal context, which is our worldview. Now, our worldview is our attempt to answer those big questions in life. The questions like, why am I here? Where am I going? Why is there suffering in the world? And a lot of the time, that worldview is responsible for some of our most instinctive reactions, especially when we read difficult passages like this. And yet, despite how fundamental worldviews are, it's very rare that we take the time to sit down and actually question, well, why do we believe what we believe? And so I think this is an excellent opportunity just to do that, just to spend a bit of time thinking, why do we believe what we believe? Again, do we take the Bible seriously in what it says about God? And an interesting question, well, how does the Bible, the worldview that the Bible puts forward, how do the answers that the Bible offers us to those big questions in life, how do they compare to a lot of the alternatives that are out there? I don't know how much research you've done into these things, how many conversations you've had with people who don't share your worldview, but I got to say, a lot of the alternatives are pretty bleak. I think the answers that the Bible gives us about these big, important questions in life are beautiful, and they knit together in a way that the very few other answers really can. So just finally, I'd like to leave you with a picture of two worlds. I guess it's another sort of thought experiment, maybe a conversation starter for some point down the road. So imagine two possible pictures of the world. The first is a world that just sprang to being out of nowhere. It wasn't created, it just happened. And matter and energy and maybe information mysteriously conspired to create chemical compounds and then life and then complex organisms. But everything in this world breaks down to just matter and energy. The supernatural doesn't exist, not a part of this picture at all. Now, the second world is a world that was spoken into being by an eternal creator. Before matter and energy existed, there was God. He was consistent and unchanging in his nature and designed a universe which would reflect the unfathomable complexity and beauty of his own mind. In this world, God is the ultimate reality. He is spirit, which transcends energy, space-time, and matter. Now, in the first world, it's important to understand people are nothing more than biological machines. Our only purpose, our only conceivable purpose, is to pass on our DNA to the next generation through reproduction. And that means, as uncomfortable as it is to admit, these things that seem horrific, things like murder and rape and torture, even though they seem bad, without God in the picture, they're just options for human interaction. There's no real concept of good and bad when our only role is to pass on our DNA. Good and bad are just illusions. Now, in the second world, people are created by God for relationship with him. They are designed to know God and to be known by him. People are intended to bring God glory through walking in obedience with him. And in this world, right and wrong aren't illusions at all. They're actually a description of our moral position relative to God. See, right and wrong can't change depending on cultural context or personal preference because they are objective moral truth derived from God's unchanging nature. Good things are in line with God's nature and bad things are opposed to God's nature. But we have to think carefully about what all this means. See, in order for an all-powerful God to be good, then he also has to be just, doesn't he? And in order for God to be truly just, well, it seems that he must favor what is good and punish what is evil, because a God who turns a blind eye to evil isn't really just at all. And so it seems that God doesn't really have a choice when it comes to punishing evil, because his righteousness requires that he do it. And therefore, it would seem that there's only one way for a just God to provide mercy to people who have deliberately chosen to do bad things. Look, he could obliterate them completely. That would resolve the situation. Or else, he could take the punishment that they deserve on himself. You and I are more than biological machines. You and I were created for a purpose, and that purpose is to know the living God. He's the one who put on humanity to suffer in our place so that we could walk in right relationship with him. And I want to propose that the only reason we feel uncomfortable when we read about people being destroyed in the Bible is that God has written his standard of right and wrong on our hearts. So far from these passages revealing God as some sort of moral monster, they actually point to the fact that we have the fingerprints of a divine creator on our hearts. Our Creator is not far removed from us, as we've seen in these passages. Even now, he is at work teaching us that he can be trusted and inviting us to partner with him in the plan that he has for humanity. And guess what? He has dignified us with the opportunity to choose what we're going to do next. And he's done that at the cost of his own son. So let's choose what's right by embracing him and walking in obedience.